Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Christmas, as you probably well know, is indeed a time for reflection. A time to revisit memory and times gone by with those you've loved and those you've lost. I should know. I am, as it happens, the ghost of Christmas past. Oh. The ghost of Christmas past. I honestly can't stand that title. For one thing, I'm not a ghost. None of us are. Being a ghost requires you were once alive and then are not alive. Hence the whole ghost business as a whole. I mean, sure, yes, I'll often take on the appearance of whatever lingering psychic impressions remain from someone from my subject's past, but it's generally more akin to a costume than any real revival. The sad truth that humans often hate to acknowledge is that once one has moved on from their mortal coil, they stay moved on for good. Ghost of Christmas past. I would have greatly preferred spirit of Christmas past, or perhaps the essence of memory. But I clearly don't get a say in any of this, so I suppose there's no real point to complaining. At least, not about that aspect of the job. I will be honest, though, I do find it very grating, and often find myself envious of my colleagues, present and future. I mean, Present's name is actually Christmas Present, though he too is erroneously saddled with the title of Ghost as well. But who doesn't like Christmas presents? Also, most of his duties just require him showing our subjects, who I suppose we can refer to as Scrooges for the sake of conversation, happy times in other homes. He gets to bring them on tours of good times and people enjoying the holiday. Future? Well, I'll be honest, he's a bit of an odd one. Sure, he brings the Scrooges into the future, scares or depresses them with lonely, sad, and entirely inevitable futures and deaths. But he also gets the chance to show them a better, brighter possibility. After all, most, if not all, of his work is entirely speculative, though he'll never admit it. Also, I did say he was a bit of an odd one. Truth be told, I'm pretty sure he likes the dread and darkness he brings our subjects into, though, again, he'd likely never admit to that either. Odd spirit, that one. But all the same, present and future both get to paint brighter pictures for our Scrooges. They get to show them what is good and happy in the now, and how they could have good and happy in the future, and just where do you think that leaves me? That's right. Every year my job is little more than to take on the appearance of someone's dead friend or relative, scoop them up with all of their bah-humbuggery and bad attitudes, and then spend a portion of the evening stewing in their regrets with them. And to make matters even worse, as we really only exist on this side of reality like this, where time moves all forward and in order, one night a year, that effectively means that such is my only experience on your plane of reality like this. Frankly, though some have told me I have a rather dark and dour attitude about the whole thing, I think if the entirety of one's earthly existence is merely to dwell on the heartbreaks, traumas, and regrets of already unpleasant or unhappy people, I'd do a decent job of keeping my chin up. I mean, honestly, you try it and see how chipper you can remain. part of this comes with this odd time thing. When not carrying out our functions, the three of us, much like most holiday spirits and a fair number of other beings or entities which only cross into your world for whatever purposes they serve, we exist in a sort of limbo state. It's hard to describe, really, but imagine a sort of ethereal break room of sorts that exists on a seventh dimensional plane and opens specifically when... Actually, you know what? Maybe we should skip all that. It's really quite confusing even for me, and I come from there. Still though, my colleagues and I typically only exist in your plane one night a year, barring any special circumstances. Which means, for every 365 of your years of Christmas, we pretty much only exist, more or less, for one. This effectively means that my only time or presence in your world is spent rooting up bad memories or expositing endless what-ifs and never-weres for already displeased and unpleasant people. The Scrooges, as I suppose I'll just keep calling them, even though there was only the one, and for some reason Dickens thought his story was unique enough to write about, even though we'd taken him on the same trip the year prior. But I digress. One of the most common regrets that seem to haunt our Scrooges tends to be almost cliché, in that beyond the numbers of more tragic or traumatic memories, heartbreak tends to rather dominate our itineraries. Now, I should point out that our kind doesn't exactly enjoy the kinds of intimacy or partnerships your kind does. So I could very easily be speaking from a place of complete ignorance. However, it is an odd thing to observe how much you tend to value your bonds, holding them as sacrosanct in your minds and hearts, when in comparison to how utterly cavalier you often end up treating them. One example which jumps to mind was a Scrooge I had to tend to just last Christmas. As usual, it was all, "I hate Christmas, and I can't wait for this garbage to be over with," and then wouldn't you know it, it all ended up stemming from a perfectly good relationship that they decided was best thrown away. This was another older Scrooge, and one I'm frankly surprised we never tended to before. Sometime back in what you call the 70s, he was a thriving businessman, selling cars or boats or... I honestly can't even be bothered to remember. He'd been married to a woman he'd known almost his entire life, and for a while they were quite happy. Then, as success began to give him an inflated overall ego, he began to stop valuing what he had enjoyed for so long. Hiring decisions at his company began shifting away from talent and qualifications and more towards whatever attractive ladies he found himself having eyes for. It wasn't long until his string of flings and affairs was discovered by his wife, and, of course, wouldn't you know it, she left him on Christmas. The two never reunited, despite several years of desperate pleading and apologizing on his part. Soon, the two fell completely out of contact, and he was left bitter, alone, and, you guessed it, utterly despising Christmas. When I paid him my visit last year, as I flitted through his memories, it became wholly apparent that it was that breakup and divorce that drove the final coffin nail into the casket containing his holiday spirit. His bitterness had grown so deep, in fact, it felt a present to show him his ex-wife's new family and their Christmas joy before passing him along to Future, who, I'll be honest, I kind of stopped paying attention to what Future does. He is, as I said, an odd one, who takes glee in strange and often dark things. Present did go as far as to tell me that the wife was actually quite happy. She had not too shortly after leaving our Scrooge met and fallen in love with another man who proved more attentive and faithful. The pair had 3 children together, raised them in a happy home, and By the time present had gotten around to them, found them celebrating with grandchildren, several of them. Again, I'm not certain about the final disposition of that Scrooge, as I tend to leave that to the others, but I couldn't help but find it such a curious thing to see the facade of gruff bitterness melt away at the sight of his long-lost love. I see it often, but it always strikes me as strange. Love is supposedly one of the central motivators and desires for your kind, and yet you so often treat it carelessly. Odd, isn't it? Of course, not all are so mundane. In some cases, serious and legitimate trauma can be the cause of a Scrooge's malcontent. These I tend to treat naturally more delicately than a simple broken heart. In some case, the point is less to force them to confront the source and more to uncover it. Humans have an impressive capacity for bearing painful or difficult memories. I, on no less than 10 occasions, have been tasked with reviving the painful memory of a Christmas car accident from one's childhood. Accidents that would claim one or both parents, drastically altering the trajectory of their lives. While I'm seldom shy to poke the bear, as you might say, in relation to ordinary heartbreak, childhood trauma typically requires a gentler hand. Those cases are often the most difficult. However, they're not always children when such happens. Sometimes delusions or denial can overtake grown minds in the wake of severe loss, in which case the job is made doubly difficult, by virtue of their often harsh reactions to truth or sustained refusal to accept it. One such case that stands out in my mind occurred quite recently, actually. A man, along with his wife and young son, had been out at a holiday party. He unfortunately drank a bit more than he ought to have and wound up driving through a red light. Another vehicle was already traveling at speed through the intersection and crashed into them. The wife and boy both died in hospital, yet the man survived. For some time, he found himself haunted by ghoulish visions of his wife and ongoing delusions that his son was still alive. It wasn't quite Christmas yet, but the powers that be decided intervention might be necessary. As such, I spent an inordinate amount of time trailing him about in the forms of his dead son. Thankfully, just near the big day, the poor man was able to recognize the truth of what had happened and begin healing. That story and that car crash really managed to stick with me. Now, something I feel important to clarify here, something I alluded to before, is in regards to the matter of being a ghost. As I mentioned, I do often, if not always, end up taking the form of someone from the subject's past. This quite naturally makes the whole process easier, as firstly, I don't really possess a form your minds could recognize, what with us being multidimensional and the like. Taking on the form of one from a person's past is both necessary to appear before them at all, while also adding a personal touch to the whole affair. When these forms are taken, it's not merely like a mask or costume. We do, in quite a real sense, inhabit your reality in these instances as the people we appear as. Their memories and thoughts and history all meld with our being, creating a sort of symbiosis between us that lasts only for the time we're at work. The true soul is, provided it has moved on and not just decided to linger and await some other person's body to tether to, fully moved on to the other side. What that is, I'm not going to tell you. You'll all get there one day on your own. But for the time we're on your plane, consider it a form of synthesis between their existence and our own. A blending, if you will. A bit like that carried out by the wayward souls who lurk in the ether, looking for new bodies. But a bit less intrusive and invasive, if I may say. Considerably less rude. If I'm to be completely honest about those souls, I dare say they're rather short-sighted. I could quite easily inhabit one of your bodies myself and experimented with such slightly many of your centuries ago. But just in the same way that you would never likely decide to trade your three-dimensional form for that of a two-dimensional stick figure in some cartoon or the like, I can't fathom why any being who has managed to transcend to higher planes of existence would be so keen to return to the lower. What can you say? Different strokes, I suppose. But again, I'm getting somewhat off topic. Being tasked with reviewing people's regrets and darker memories is usually, almost always in fact, a grating and taxing endeavor. I would much rather spend the time revisiting pleasant memories, and have even put in a request to have my duties shifted to do just that. I've experimented with it a bit and have found that in a number of cases, the Scrooge can be sort of reminded of the good times, as opposed to being made to reflect and dwell on the bad ones to such an extent that they find a renewed sense of joy through the memory itself. Present, though, says that always messes up his plans, and Future dislikes it when grim potentiality of the subject's lonesome and bitter deaths is disrupted by the more jovial sense left from the experience. So, I continue with my tasks every year without fail. Take on a form plucked from their memories, retrieve some essence of that person's soul and reality, incorporate it to my own, and then it's off to loads of usually crying, sometimes shouting, and on more than a regular occasion, hollow and impotent threats against me. I will admit I do find those very amusing, if not a little sad, as they clearly come from places of pain and frustration. Now, a heartbreak, loss, death, and tragedy do tend to dominate the field as it was. Sometimes the Scrooge's overall disposition regarding Christmas comes less from a place of bitterness or malice, and more honestly from a place of outright stupidity. One recent example leaps eagerly to mind, and I'm sure you'll find it as macabre, yet stupidly funny as I did. So, not every interaction I have with your kind takes place with me appearing as someone you know from your past. Sometimes I get to cheat and perform a little shortcut. Just recently, prior to present and future taking on their roles, for which I will add they had to appear in person, I actually got to walk a Scrooge down memory lane over the telephone. Granted, I wasn't actually talking into a telephone, as that would be honestly redundant and rather pointless. However, this man was quite upset with some shop or business. Naturally, his upset had nothing to do with the microwave oven he was calling to complain about, but rather harkened back to some grim horror from his childhood. Grim, and I will say it without hesitation, extraordinarily stupid. As it was a work night for me, and he was clearly in dire need of our services, he had his call rerouted from the shop and share store he was calling, and directed to us. I even had to go as far as impersonating my own assistant, which, in point of fact, I don't actually have at all. After listening to him huff and puff about how his appliance was broken, I merely reminded him of the time he'd murdered a puppy in one by cooking it on high when he was a child. A considerably scarring event which he carried around for ages, something he ended up eventually burying in his subconscious, as he dare not remember it voluntarily. Thus, each Christmas he'd fly into a fit about his microwave, oftentimes hurling them into the garbage, if he even had one at all, and would begin making phone call after phone call, demanding answers that he simply wasn't ready or able to hear or accept. Finally, this very year actually, his psyche suggested he may just in fact be ready to face the truth, which had ruined every winter for him since he was a boy. It didn't take long to break him. Wishing him a Merry Christmas at the end of the call, I quickly passed along the assignment to Present, who, for some strange reason, got it into his head that pursuing the whole dead puppy angle might be helpful, showing him his nephew, who had just received a puppy for Christmas, and highlighting how much joy the animal brought him. An odd action, of course, at least by my standards, but I suppose since it worked out in the end, that you can't really argue with results. However, all this aside, on a broader level, while I do in fact find the work generally rather depressing, and really wouldn't mind switching places with my colleagues if only for 1 year, I cannot argue with its importance. People often forget, all too often, how it is memory which forges identity, and as such, lays the groundwork for who they are as people. Their present and future all being the sum result of a sort of equation, combining the totality of variables and events of their past into what I like to refer to as the perpetual moment. The seamless ongoing now, rooted in the ever-expanding series of previous nows, which as soon as they've happened, we take to calling then. Just consider your time with me here. From where we began to where we are, one continuous moment has evolved into this moment right now and right here. It is for this reason that when I say this work is important, I mean that not only for myself, but for those who, with or without my assistance, take the time to remember and reflect on the past and how it had led them to where they are. Ideally, when done on one's own, it can afford a deeper context for what it is that fills one's life and makes it meaningful. And should one have some trouble with this, well, I suppose that's where I come in.
Chilling tales for dark nights.